These are the 5 most disappointing Pokemon in Generation 9 released in Scarlet and Violet, and starting off the list, we have toadscruel. By far, probably one of the most disappointing Pokemon released in Generation 9, and it's straight up baffling for a couple of reasons. Game Freak gave this Pokemon a lot of better tools compared to its counterpart, especially with the move Spore, a grass-type move that is very potent as it has a 100% accuracy in putting your opponent to sleep. With the base stat of 100, this makes an exceptionally fast Pokemon to Spore the other side, except Game Freak gave it an ability that completely negates any hope of defensive utility in the form of Mycelium Might, an ability that has a move last every time it wants to use a status move. The one thing that really made toadscruel unique and set it up for success was all tumble down with this singular ability, as opponents could do sizable super effective damage before they fall asleep. Because of this, its lacking offenses, physical defense, and especially poor typing start to really show out more than ever. It is basically subjugated to basically use more offensive moves, and on a Pokemon with the base 80 special attack, that doesn't really mean much. Game Freak might have been concerned that a Pokemon this fast that can Spore might ruin the competitive scene, but when you make a Pokemon like Garganacl with its own ridiculous ability and great signature move, this one to me, in my opinion, will always stand out as a head scratcher more than ever. Now, many sleep moves were banned from the singles later on, so perhaps this argument is void until you realize it has other status moves in the form of Toxic and Stun Spore that could be very useful in battle. It's so bad in this generation that it's still being outclassed by its Cantonian counterpart that was released more than 25 years ago, as toadscruel itself sulks down in the ZU tier. When we think of third legendaries on the battlefield, what really sets them apart is their ideal uniqueness when compared to the box art legends, and looking back at the past couple of generations, you can clearly see that pattern with Eternatus, Necrozma in its forms, Zygarde in its forms, etc. But probably one of the most unique ones of recent release has to be Terapagos, as this is probably one of the first times that a Pokemon's main gimmick relies on the main mechanic of the generation itself, and that being terrestrialization, although that boon would not be a boon for much longer as it turned out to be. Terapagos is a 3-formed Pokemon, as its base form transforms into Terrestrial Terapagos, and then thereafter Terapagos Stellar when terrestrialized. The unique thing about Terapagos is in fact of 1, its stellar form, but 2, it increases its base stats as it keeps changing form until its stellar form it maxes at a clear-cut 700 BST, which is extremely high for a legendary Pokemon. But therein lies the problem, the fact its BST keeps increasing with every form change. Terrestrial Terapagos, its base form in battle, as its first form can in battle to begin with, has a BST of 600, which when competing with other legendaries and Ubers is criminally low. This, and combined with having a singular type of normal, doesn't really bode well when competing against other hyper-offensive Pokemon, as in Ubers, most Pokemon are able to surpass its base 85 speed with rather ease. But that could be compensated if Terapagos in turn had supreme offenses to punish its opponents and their bulk, to which it would be sorely mistaken until it terrestrializes and gains all those base stat buffs. In competitive singles, one of the things that can derail a Pokemon in Generation 9 is being too reliant on terrestrialization on a singular Pokemon to be good, as this can oftentimes lead to a predictability and team constraint altogether, and quickly for Terapagos, it was finding that this was very much the problem as soon as it was competing with other legendaries of its supposed caliber. Terapagos was trying to be terra reliant in order to in the first place to reach those impeccable base stats that is so desperately needed in order to stay relevant in the first place. But that just needed to compete, not to mention its mono-normal type and still lack of speed were also two huge glaring issues it had to resolve. So then the question becomes why terrestrialize a Pokemon that has other glaring issues to resolve, and also that is terra aligned for it to be somewhat decent to begin with, when you have other monstrous Pokemon that only see terra as an addition to its powerful strengths such as Koraidon, Miraidon, NDM, etc. The one thing Terapagos does have in Rapid Spin, even that is outclassed as a premier hazard remover, with the bulky Origin Giratina, as it has Defog and was immune to those rapid spins to begin with its ghost typing. For a third legendary being hyped all this much only to be down in the non-ranked part of Ubers, the same ranking as a Pokemon as Annihilate, a Pokemon released a whole year before you and isn't even a third legendary, is just pitiful and sorely disappointing to say the least. I wonder how this Pokemon could translate in the later generations, as its gimmick is reliant on the mechanic of terrestrialization, but that's another conversation for another day. What's not for another day though is in fact, if you guys are enjoying this video, consider subscribing, as that lets me know you guys want more Pokemon content just like this. Thank you, and let's get back to the video. Now, Terapagos being Terra aligned is because of its stats and gimmick, but probably another infamous Pokemon that is reliant on Terra has to be Wo-Chien, one of the 4 Quartet Pokemon released in Gen 9's base game that immediately become one of the game's most disappointing Pokemon. Unlike its counterparts, Wo-Chien has ever found it difficult to gain any real footing in the high competitive scene, thanks to its disgusting defensive typing.
Fix that garbage.
The way the Dark Quartet was designed was that there were 2 overpowered offensive Pokemon and 2 solid defensive Pokemon. One of the defensive Pokemon has been solid, but the other one not so much. Wo-Chien severely struggles due to a lack of good typing on its side, with it having Grass and Dark as its type combination. Now, this type combo is actually very familiar, as it's on one of OU's premier attacker, Meowscarada, but the difference of how Meowscarada could make this work is due to its excellent offenses and incredible ability that allowed to change type whenever it wished. These 2 categories alone allows it to bypass its huge Grass and Dark type combo, letting it thrive in the high tiers of competitive play. Wo-Chien, on the other hand, isn't a fast hyper-offensive Pokemon, and doesn't have an ability to bypass this huge weakness. It does, however, have a pretty good base stat total, and a pretty good distribution alongside meaningful moves such as Knock Off and Leech Seed, but in order to make use of it, someone has to change its typing, and what better way than Terastallization. This in itself offered the same issue that Terapagos has, and that was Wo-Chien was being Terra aligned soon enough in order to be successful as a defensive presence for your side. This quickly led to it being very Terra aligned, very predictable, and team constraining for many players. Similar to Terapagos, thus it was being found in lower tiers of competitive play. Although its special defensive utility would be missed, Tingle has been picking up that slack in both departments, often being one of the game's best defensive specialists all around, making us quickly forget the sheer disappointment that this lovable snail had on its players. But probably something that was even more disappointing to begin with has to be the release of Scovillain, Pokemon's first grass and fire type within the game's history. From hearing around, getting the fire and grass type Pokemon was something of excitement, especially since it was noted to be a spicy pepper, making the typing more justifiable and satisfying, except many players were found very disappointed as we inspected this Pokemon further. Scovillain's main problem lies in the fact that it cannot decide whether to be purely physical or purely special attack. This is problematic for a couple of reasons. Now, you might note that legendaries and other high tier Pokemon have somewhat both investments in physical and special attack, but what makes this work is because they have high base stats. Usually this isn't a problem with their high speed stat, and going back to Scovillain, you'll notice that that's actually its biggest issue. Because it already has a low base stat total, having its stats basically maximized as much as possible is more important in order to guarantee more use in competitive play. For example, with a Pokemon like Clodsire with a similar base stat total, you can expect it not to be known as that special wall in OU, as much if it had that stat spread into defense than its HP and special defense alone. Regardless, the even offensive stat distribution in today's day and age isn't all that impressive at a clip of 108 in each stat. 108 is actually 3 more points than legendary Styrian's special attacking stat, so not only does it have that speed issue, but it also has an offensive firepower issue. And sure, it can set up and probably get around, but if you're boasting 65 in each of its defensive stats and HP, that typically won't let it get much done within the higher tiers of competitive play. Thus, it's no wonder it shares the same tier of toadscruel in CU. Fortunately though, I'm glad Game Freak made up this and gave us a way better fire and grass type in the form of Heartflame Ogerpon, because that was one kind of special menace on the battlefield. The final most disappointing Pokemon has to be Iron Thorns, probably the worst Paradox Pokemon to be ever released. When you were a Paradox form or an alternate version of a famous pseudo-legendary Pokemon such as Tyranitar, the expectation is that you'll be somewhat close in power level and in terms of significance in the metagame. However, it has done neither of that. Right off the bat, Iron Thorns has 30 less BST than its present day counterpart, which is already a red flag because having less base stats total can have a major implication in regards of how it will be played out. Except Game Freak gave the option for Iron Thorns to actually run rampant in the metagame, making it much faster than it could ever ask for at a base 72 in speed, as well as compromising its special defensive stat as well. 72 base speed, well, I mean, you might have stuck with the old speed stat, and the lower special defense is actually much more worse for this Pokemon for a couple of other reasons. For starters, Iron Thorns doesn't have the ability of Sandstream, that buffs rock type special defense underneath the weather, so its special defense is more exposed, and doubly at that matter as Game Freak gave it its future version yet another awful defensive typing of rock and electric, making it have one of the most common types in the game of ground, a 4 times weakness for it. Combining both of these factors, that lower special defense really starts to become a huge problem, as well as defensive identity as a whole, not to mention the other weaknesses it has on its side. Its typing also poses another threat on the offensive end, as being a physical attacker with arguably the two poorest types on that end doesn't really help its purpose. Being part electric for Iron Thorns literally doesn't do much other than the fact that it will be spamming more Supercell slams, which also comes with a huge backlash if it misses. Furthermore, Rock as an offensive typing for physical attackers doesn't do any good favors, as Rock side is weak and Stone Edge can be inaccurate. So in short, Iron Thorns was also given a typing that was very skeptical offensively to begin with. If Iron Thorns was designed as a special attacker instead, this Pokemon would become more of a beast because its typing would be more suited for that. However, the fact remains it clearly is not. For being a Paradox Pokemon and based on a popular pseudo-legendary, you would think all the weak points of Tyranitar, they would try to change and make this future version much better than the present version, or at least somewhat comparable. We were instead given a much worse version, and frankly probably one of the most forgettable Paradox Pokemon because of it. Bad typing and bad BST redistribution of stats is what really killed this Pokemon in the end. And there you have it. Those are the 5 most disappointing Generation 9 Pokemon in my opinion. Now for those of you asking why probably none of the Lousy Trio was covered, well, it's because I've already covered them extensively on my channel recently, thus I don't want to sound too repetitive for you guys. Let me know in the comments below though what you guys think and any other disappointing Pokemon I failed to make a mention of. Comment below the water emoji, join the Chompy Discord, and until next time, thanks for watching as always.